All right, so here we are. This is our last lecture for the second section of the course. We're going to cover chapter 25, look at the period of the 1920s. This is material that will not be covered by any essay questions, but it will contain the last 5 questions that you will have to answer for the objective portion of the test. So we want to handle this in a fairly quick fashion. The 1920s is a period that was very famous, is very famous, as the Roaring Twenties, and that's the impression that still lingers from that decade. It was a decade when America would undergo a brief depression as a result of winding down expenses or dealing with the expenses of World War I, winding down munitions manufacturing for both our own purposes and that of the Allies, and adjusting back to a civilian economy. But after that happened, there would be an ushering in of a long period of very great prosperity. The stock market would go through the roof. Americans would find more and more new technologies flooding into the marketplace at cheaper and cheaper prices. This is the point when America is going to take the step of being more urban than being rural. It was a period in which moral standards loosened up quite a bit, and that's not surprising. Women's dresses got shorter, dances changed. You found women smoking and wearing makeup for the first time. There was a general loosening of moral strictures, and of course one of the reasons for that is that this is in the aftermath of World War. You had 2 million American men and boys go overseas. They've seen and experienced all kinds of different things, not just the horrors of war, but recall that whenever you get into a great big war, society basically gives millions upon millions of men permission to break rule number 1 of human civilization. And rule number 1 of human civilization is thou shalt not kill. Well, in wartime, it's permissible to kill, so long as you're killing with the sanction of a cause or a government. And killing becomes art and science. And if you're very good at it, you're considered to be a successful commander or a successful soldier. And if you give permission to break that rule of human civilization, it becomes a lot harder to enforce all of the other rules. And of course, the movement of millions of men means the breaking up of relationships. It means faster marriages. It means infidelity. And it brings all kinds of cultural change with it. For example, before World War I, American women did not wear makeup, or only a certain kind of American woman wore makeup, and those were prostitutes. And makeup was considered to be a tawdry thing. But when the doughboys got to France, French women wore makeup all the time, and that was a mainstream thing. They wore perfume, mainstream thing. And so the doughboys brought home perfume and makeup to give to their wives and their sweethearts and their sisters and their mothers. And how could these women decline the gift of the conquering American heroes? And so they took to wearing perfume and makeup, and it changed the norm in society. The wartime needs had required tailors and seamstresses to use less and less cloth in clothing. So the fashions changed a great deal, and now suddenly you had women who were wearing dresses that only went an inch or 2 below their knees, and that was considered scandalous by some, and a welcome sense of modernization by others. Women's bathing suits are going to change in this period, so that they're actually going to show some of their legs and some of their arms. You're going to find women smoking. All these things were considered scandalous, and we get this this picture of the age of the flapper and the Charleston and all these kinds of things, when the automobile begins to take over American culture to a large extent. This is the era that gives you books like The Great Gatsby, for example, enormous amount of wealth is being generated by these new technologies. A lot of that wealth had been created by the war itself. And so there was a general topsy-turving of society, if you will. And that means rapid change. And as we pointed out before, rapid change is something that people do not like. And as the Treaty of Versailles turned out to be a harsh and vindictive peace, or at least it was seen that way by a lot of people, Americans came to feel that their entry into World War I had probably been something of a mistake, that all that we had managed to do really was to save the British and French empires and to expand them, and that our contribution to the war was being denigrated by our former allies. Americans were unhappy with what was happening in Europe after the war, the difficulty of the Allied powers to repay their loans to the United States that they had taken out during the war. And as a consequence of that, America sort of turned in on itself. We sort of turned our back to a certain extent on the affairs of Europe, at least, and drifted toward a policy of isolationism. Americans had gone and we had repaid our debt to France. We had punished the Germans for submarine warfare, but we really didn't want to become involved in the world's problems. We would look out after our own interests, but being the world's policeman, or providing the muscle for something like the League of Nations to use as a police force was not something Americans were very interested in. We had plenty of opportunity here at home, and we had plenty of our own problems here at home as well. So in the 1920s, America was a very vibrant place. It was a changing culture. It was a rapidly expanding economy. It was in the 1920s that Americans attained the highest standard of living of any people on the planet, which means they have the highest standard of living of any people in all of human history. Between 1922 and 1929, the GNP, that is the gross national product, the accumulated value of all the things that Americans made and produced, rose by 40% as our industrial output doubled. Per capita income increased by 30%. So this is, all the wealth being produced in the United States divided by the number of citizens we had. That increases by 30%, so that it's $681 in 1929. And what this means is more Americans than ever before are able to live a middle-class existence, or to come very close to living a middle-class existence. There were new growth industries that made life much easier and much more enjoyable than it had been before, especially automobiles, furniture, clothing, particularly appliances, so things like refrigerators and stoves and radios and phonograph players and washing machines, become inexpensive enough to flood the marketplace, and Americans are able to get a hold of these things. And of course, having a refrigerator or a washing machine or something like that, a car, is going to make your life much, much easier. It's going to simplify a lot of otherwise onerous daily tasks. And so this was an era where Americans had a great deal of confidence in themselves and their country. The old progressive spirit was beginning to fade away. That reform movement had sort of burned itself out. It wasn't completely gone. And there continued to be labor unrest and strikes and push for 8-hour workdays, which would largely turn out to be successful, especially with the help of the Republican administrations of Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, but they presided over an era in which the modern consumer society really came into its own. And one of the things that was especially compelling about this period is it sort of finalized a change that we had been moving toward for a long time, probably since before the Civil War. And that was the switch from a rural to an urban majority. In 1920, there was a U.S. Census, and in 1920, the census announced that for the first time in American history, a little over half of the population lived in cities or towns. Now, a town was loosely defined as a population of 2,500 people. It's pretty tiny compared to modern day standards, but it was a sizable enough community at the time to be considered urban. And so in 1920, for the first time, more Americans live in towns and cities than lives on farms and ranches. And of course, as people move to towns and cities, they have a different pace of life, they have a different kind of a lifestyle, they have different opportunities, employment opportunities, entertainment opportunities. It leads to a kind of different cultural outlook, and they have different kinds of problems than the people who live in rural America and are still engaged in agriculture. The war had ended, but the after effects of the war are going to linger for some time. One of the things that Woodrow Wilson had been afraid of is that once the United States went to war, its people would become highly intolerant. The Germans had practiced sabotage against American industry during the war. They'd blown up munitions factories and these sorts of things that we were, after all, making arms and equipment that would be used by Allied soldiers. The Germans were trying to disrupt that. This had led to draconian laws passed during the war against espionage, against subversion, against sabotage and treason. And these kind of laws had been robustly used by the Wilson administration. And so there was a lot of Americanization that was going on. To prove their loyalty to the country, a lot of recent immigrants became hyper-patriotic. A lot of people had German last names, changed them. They anglicized this pronunciation and the spelling so they wouldn't be so obviously German. And there was just a general sense of intolerance toward anything that threatened the war effort, that smacked of being un-American. And of course, one of the ways that World War I ended was on a note of Bolshevik revolution, the rise of communism in the former Russian Empire, where there's going to be a violent and vicious years-long civil war between the communists, the Reds, and the old imperialists, the Whites. It's going to be exceptionally brutal and nasty. Of course, one of the reasons that Germany had finally collapsed is the threat of a Bolshevik revolution at home. Bolshevik is just a good early 20th century word for communist. And this communist revolution, the success of it in Russia, was a great shock to everybody. It brought down one of the great empires, one of the ancient empires of the world, and an empire that had, in the second half of the 19th century, been very friendly to the United States. And the fact that it could collapse and what replaced it was so authoritarian, so totalitarian, despite its protestations of being all about the people and for the people and these sorts of things, it became evident pretty quickly that the Russian people had simply exchanged one form of tyranny for an even worse form of tyranny. There was still a lot of communist propaganda, Bolshevik propaganda that was out there as the Bolsheviks in Eastern Europe and the former Russian Empire tried to export their revolution, tried to cause a general uprising of workers all around the world, including in the United States, against the middle classes and capitalism, to tear down democracies and destroy capitalism. And of course, all of these ideas were extremely unpopular in the United States. The American people could look around and they could see that capitalism was the best system. It was the system that had produced America's wealth. That it was produced certainly its share of problems, but produced far more good than bad, lifting people out of poverty, employing people, bringing forward technological and scientific evolution and revolution, and markets had helped to allow goods to become cheaper and get into the hands of people and these sorts of things. So Americans did not like the ideas of socialism, anarchism, and especially Bolshevism, and they were terrified of the talk of the Bolsheviks of a worldwide revolution. Well, one of the ironic things is that at this point, the communists who are taking over in Russia are so weak, so poor, that they have no ability to actually export revolution, and yet it is this point in history when they are at their nadir, when they're at the bottom of their barrel, that they are talking the loudest. They're trying to, cheer their cause and hope that other people pick it up. And of course, there had always been a communist movement in the United States, at least in the second half of the 19th century. It existed along with socialists and anarchists, and had helped to, sour American opinions toward labor unions and that sort of thing. And so there was a great deal of fear in the United States that there might be an attempted Bolshevik revolution here in America. And this fear produced what is known as the Red Scare. The Red Scare. And that feeds off the heightened sense of nationalism that had been unleashed during World War I. Well, the war's over, but this heightened sense of nationalism is still there, and that heightened sense of nationalism demanded uniformity, unity, and conformity as a sign that you embraced America, that you were American. You were for the red, white, and blue. And most Americans saw the immigrant as the greatest threat of bringing Bolshevik revolution to the United States. You have to remember there's something like 25 million immigrants had flooded into America in the last decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, and many of them came from Southern and Eastern Europe. There had been a great shift in immigration in the second half of the 19th century. People were no longer coming from Western and Northern Europe, which were primarily Protestant countries that had something like democratic institutions of one kind or another. The traditional sources of American immigration from Northern and Western Europe. Now they had come from Southern and Eastern Europe. They'd come from countries where the people were Catholic, and they were Jew, and they were Greek Orthodox. And they used a different alphabet, some of them, and their customs and their dress were very different than Americans, and very different from those of Northern and Western Europe. And of course, it's in this region of the world that World War I had started. It was in this region of the world where Bolshevism had suddenly enjoyed this great success. And so immigrants were seen to be a grave threat. There was already, of course, a problem that you had with a lot of Americans in viewing immigrants, is that the immigrant comes over, he doesn't speak your language, he doesn't practice your custom, he comes from a very different place, and the initial wave of immigrants have a hard time adjusting because they're adults, and it's hard to abandon the habits of a lifetime, to leave behind what you've always known. And so they assimilated very imperfectly, no matter how much they wanted to embrace the American idea. It's their children who grow up with one foot in the old culture and one foot in the new culture who will begin to bridge that divide, and then the grandchildren of these immigrants who will be born and reared purely in an American culture, an American system, that complete the process of assimilation. But it means that it takes about 2.5 generations to get there. And in the interim, a lot of Americans question whether or not these immigrants were really willing to be loyal Americans, or if they owed their allegiance to their old mother country or to the Catholic Church or something like that. A lot of these fears were irrational. They were driven by economic competition. They were driven by the fact that you could go into any of the big cities, especially in the northeastern part of the country, and walk down the streets, and you would go into neighborhoods where it seemed like you weren't in America at all, where all of the signs were in a foreign language, and people dressed differently, and you heard different languages and these sorts of things. And that sort of reinforced the idea that the immigrants wanted to come over here. They wanted to take jobs, work for next to nothing, drive down wages, and didn't want to really become Americans. They wanted to take space. They wanted to get American women. Somehow that was always part of the argument against immigrants. But they were seen as kind of something as an infection. And so Americans were highly suspicious of them. They always had been. This is true, by the way, of every immigrant group that ever came into the country. You can go talk about the German immigrants who came in the 1850. You talk about the Irish immigrants who came into the 1840. They met the same kind of fear, dread, suspicion, and consequently discrimination as well. And since a lot of these recent immigrants had jobs in industrial America, they worked in those bad conditions for those poor wages, those long hours. Many of them became involved in labor unrest, which of course this then is another mark against them in the eyes of a lot of Americans. This anti-immigrant sentiment is known as nativism. Nativism. America should be for the people who are born here and the people who represent what America really is and what America is really all about. And this of course, is sort of a contradictory philosophy. It ignores the fact that everybody who was in America had come from someplace else, all the way back to the Native Americans. If we look at what archaeologists have discovered, the human beings migrated to the North American continent over a land bridge that used to connect Asia to North America in Alaska. And so everybody, to some extent or another, is an immigrant. But if your family immigrated here 100 or 200 years ago, you don't perceive yourself as of immigrant stock necessarily. People tend to have economic fears, feed cultural fears and political fears. And so in the aftermath of World War I, there was a lot of talk about Bolshevik revolution around the world. There was an example of successful Bolshevik revolution in Russia. And in the aftermath of the war, so when you suddenly had a lot of labor unrest, so there was a general strike in Seattle, and there was a police strike in Boston, there were violent strikes in the steel and iron industries. A lot of this is really driven by the same things that had driven labor unrest before the dawn of the 20th century. Some of this is residual effects of World War I, where labor had deferred demands for better wages, better working conditions, better hours under the stress and the need of wartime production quotas, and now the war was over, and these pent-up issues were coming back. So there was a wave of labor unrest, and remember that most people perceive labor unions as being politically suspect kind of organizations where you would find anarchists, communists, socialists, that sort of thing. And then this was all exacerbated in the spring and summer of 1919 when a series of what today we would call terrorist attacks occurred in American cities. 16 letter bombs sent to famous Americans, a bomb that was placed in the home of the United States Attorney General Mitchell Palmer and blew up in early June of 1919. And this looked very much like an effort by the Bolsheviks to destabilize society, to collapse law and order, and to pave the way for the undermining of the American system of government and the capitalist economic system, and usher in a communist revolution like had overwhelmed Russia. So there was a public outcry that something had to be done about this. The public's response to being afraid is to demand action from the government, and very often to take action on their own. And so this is the Red Scare. People are afraid of a communist revolution. Now they demand that something be done to protect the country against it, and the government responded. This is still the government of Woodrow Wilson, remember. He's president until after the election of 1920 is over. So the Wilson administration that had, taken this very strong stand against anti-American activities during World War I is continuing that now in the face of the Red Scare. November 7th, 1919, the FBI went out and it rounded up political malcontents, suspected anarchist and communist. And in December of that same year, it deported 249 of them to Russia. There was no due process. These people were not charged of crimes. They were not brought before a court or a jury. They were people who had reputations for speaking out on behalf of communism and politically un-American ideas, and so they were thrown out of the country. And this was just the first step. This is sort of like getting the ringleaders. In January of 1920, some 4,000 suspected communists and Bolsheviks were arrested in a single night. They were rounded up and thrown in jail, and many of them were deported. And this was all very popular. The American people approved of it wholeheartedly by and large, and those who didn't were, at least for a time, afraid to speak out, afraid to be seen as sympathizing with these unpopular ideas, afraid that they would get caught up in the hysteria and be punished for it as well, lose their jobs, use their livelihood, use their respectability, maybe even lose their right to live in the country of their birth. But when a mob mentality grips the public, this is the sort of thing that can happen. And more extreme measures were urged. One of the slogans of the time was SOS, the way that you dealt with the communist threat was SOS, not the maritime distress signal, SOS, save our ship, but SOS, the political reaction to the Red Scare, was said, ship or shoot. The way that you deal with the communists is you round them up and you either deport them by shipping them to Russia, or you put them up against a wall and you shoot them. And in some instances, local communities didn't wait for the government or law enforcement to deal with this. Otherwise, good, law-abiding, upright, everyday Americans who went to church on Sunday, who worked hard, who loved their family and took care of their neighbors, could become so enraptured with fear of communism that they would strike out against suspected communists in their own neighborhoods. And this led to beatings, it led to murders, and these sorts of things. And none of these acts were ever really investigated, let alone punished. And of course, what happens when this kind of panic grips people is that it doesn't take very long for it to overplay its hand, to go too far. It becomes too shocking. It rattles the sensibilities. It threatens the rule of law and order, the very precept on which democratic government is built. And it was the government that pushes back against it. And particularly a senator from Ohio by the name of Warren G. Harding, a Republican who's going to run for the presidency in 1920, he pushes back against this. In his presidential campaign, he says, quote, "Too much has been said about Bolshevism in America. We need to get a grip, people." There were probably only about 60,000 Bolsheviks, real Bolsheviks, in the entire United States population. It's a tiny, tiny sliver of the body politic, but they tended to be concentrated in big cities, and so being grouped together near the big newspapers and that kind of thing, they seem to have numbers and a power well beyond their means. But people like Harding said, look, take a deep breath, calm down. There's really nothing to fear here. There's certainly no need for mob justice, and we need to follow the rule of law. If we don't follow the rule of law, then we become the very thing that we are fighting against, which is always a rule that you have to keep in mind. If you decide that an evil is so evil that you can do anything to confront it, you can throw away any norm, any law, any sense of justice and fair play, then you may defeat that evil, but you will replace that evil. You will have become the thing that you were fighting against. The Labor Department insisted that there be due process. If you want to arrest people, you got to charge them with a crime. And having unpopular ideas and saying unpopular things is not a crime. We have a First Amendment that guarantees the freedom of speech. We have a Constitution, a Bill of Rights that say you have the right to assemble peacefully and you have the right to petition your government. And the ballot box is the place where where ideas succeed or fall. It's the discourse, the exchange of ideas that allow progress, that allow people to move forward and to improve the country. If you start arresting people because of the things that they say, the things that they believe, the place that they come from, then you're not a democracy anymore. You become a parody of a democracy. You become, in fact, or you begin to become a totalitarian state. You begin to become a fascist state. And how many people have to get arrested? How many people have to get their lives or their livelihoods destroyed before everybody else sort of gets the message? Oh, there's things we can't say, or we have to be careful about saying things. We can't say what we believe. We have to hide those ideas. We have to hide those beliefs for fear that we too will get caught up and we will get punished, and our lives and our livelihoods and our families will be destroyed. And it was the government that said, no, we're not going to do that. That is not America. That is not who we are. And so the Labor Department pushed back, and candidate Harding pushed back. And it didn't work immediately, of course, but inevitably the fears of Bolshevik revolution proved to be unfounded. And perhaps the moment that sort of, made it clear that everybody was freaking out unnecessarily was the May Day 1920. So May Day was a relatively new day on the calendar. It had become a day of worker solidarity. It was a holiday in the newly Bolshevik Russia, and there were rumors that got out that May Day of 1920 was the day that the Bolsheviks were going to start their grand revolution. They were going to come out into the streets. They're going to try and tear down the government and the capitalist system. And the Attorney General, General Palmer, warned the country that this was about to happen. The country girded itself for an attempted revolution in New York City. The entire police department, 11,000 men, were out on the street that day. And what happened? There was no revolution. Of course there wasn't a revolution. For one thing, if you wanted to start one and you looked out your window that morning, there were 11,000 cops on the street in New York, you might say, let's wait till next week or something like that. But the reality is the Bolsheviks were good talkers, and there were some people who had been willing to take extreme steps and terrorist acts and that kind of thing, but they were a minority. They did not have the support of the American people. They did not have the support of very much of the press, and everybody silently kind of took a breath, realized what was going on. And one of the reasons that Warren G. Harding won that landslide election in 1920 was because he'd stood up to this. He stood up to this. He had stood up for what Americans considered to be their real values and their real ideas. But this Red Scare is also kind of an element of something else that's going on in the 1920s that is the result of this switch from a largely rural America to a largely urban America. And that's something historians label the rural counterattack. The rural counterattack. The people in rural America did not like where the country was going. They saw the cities as these harborers of vice and corruption and Bolshevism and greed and all these sorts of things. And as a source, there was a big push to sort of a culture war, if you will, between urban America and rural America. And this, one of the elements of this was prohibition. Now we remember that the 18th Amendment gives the U.S. government the power to establish prohibition. That was passed through Congress in 1917. It was sent out to the states. Then the last of them, needed 36 at that point, ratified the 18th Amendment on January 29th of 1919. One of the reasons that the 18th Amendment gets through the Congress, ironically, is World War I, because there had been a great fear of American mothers that sending their boys off into the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps was going to corrupt them morally. They would learn to cuss, and they would learn to drink, and they would go whoring, and these sorts of things. And even if they survived the war, which of course most men survive war, they would come home different. They would be ruined as fine young men, and the government had promised them, no, we're not going to let that happen to them. We're going to shield them. So we may send them to the trenches of World War I, where they could be killed or maimed, but we're not going to let them become alcoholics. And so that had been a big part of getting this ancient idea, or ancient for America, that the first temperance movements had begun in the 1820s, and their origins were in the colonial period, to get that into the Constitution. Now, authorizing the government to impose prohibition is not imposing it. Okay, all the 18th Amendment does is says the government has that power. And the federal government, of course, is usually a lagging indicator. The states, and this is one of the glories of the federal system, the states can do things on their own. And by 1920, some 26 out of 48 states had laws, prohibition laws of some sort or another. But once you get the 18th Amendment codified in the Constitution, the U.S. Congress acts. So on January 16th of 1920, the U.S. Congress passed something called the Volstead Act, V-O-L-S-T-E-A-D, the Volstead Act, which is actually the law that implements the 18th Amendment. It implements national prohibition. At that point, it became illegal to make, sell, or transport any drink with more than 1/2% alcohol in its content. So the Volstead Act passed in January of 1920, just a year after the 18th Amendment is ratified, makes it illegal to make, to sell, or to transport any drink with more than 1/2% alcohol in its content. Now, there were all sorts of exceptions. Medicines were exempted. Liquors used like wine for religious purposes were exempted, and that sort of thing. But this found a large approval, especially Methodist and Baptist anti-saloon leagues. Progressives were all in favor of prohibition because it would wipe out alcoholism, which of course was the source of so many their evils. But this was really swimming upstream. Liquor, alcohol had been part of American culture since the very beginning. And to suddenly tell people that this part of your culture is no longer acceptable, it's illegal now. Can you imagine 1/2% alcohol? Most cough syrups would be illegal today under that period. And the problem was the law was really unenforceable. In a lot of places, you simply got a ticket, a fine for being caught with liquor. There was you had basically turned a huge chunk of the population overnight from law-abiding citizens to criminals. If you wanted to have a beer, if you wanted to have a hard liquor, if you wanted to have the champagne at a wedding or wine at a dinner party, these sorts of things, you were suddenly a criminal. And of course, people, went about doing what they had always done. In a lot of places, law enforcement looked the other way. This opened the door for corruption. Judges, law enforcement officials being bribed to look the other way. Smuggling became a big industry, a $40 million a year business. By 1924, you had $2 billion being made annually from bootlegging during Prohibition. It accounts for 2% of the entire gross national product. The speakeasy, the sort of behind closed doors. This is where you can come and buy a drink and sit around with your friends and have a beer or a mixed drink or something like that. You just had to know somebody. You had to know the secret knock, that kind of thing. It bred disrespect for the law. And there was a resistance to it, especially in the cities where, of course, it's very hard to keep people from engaging in this kind of behavior. But because suddenly it had been made illegal, you open the door for criminal activity to come into it because people want the stuff. and they're going to get the stuff, and they're going to use the stuff, and there's nothing that you can do to keep such a large number of people from engaging in an activity that had heretofore been completely legal. And so this is where you get the introduction of the mobster and the mob. It was really born from Prohibition. So people like Al Capone, for example, made illegal illicit fortunes by illegally manufacturing and selling and transporting liquor. They took those profits and they used them to corrupt judicial officials, to corrupt political officials, to corrupt law enforcement officials. They used them to expand into other areas of criminal activity. So things like loan sharking, prostitution, illegal gambling, these kinds of things. Of course, the mobs were well armed and they could defy the police. And Chicago was almost run for a time by Al Capone, and efforts by the government to deal with these mobsters did not initially meet with success. Ironically, one of the ways they finally got most of them was with tax law. Al Capone covered his tracks pretty well for all of his illegal activities, but he didn't hide the wealth, and he was getting these huge deposits in his bank account. Basically speaking, he wasn't paying taxes on them and not paying taxes against the law, and that's the way the government or the way the government actually did finally bring him down. So this is the era of the mobster is born in the 20s, is going to extend for a time into the 30s, and basically Prohibition just couldn't work. You couldn't do it. You couldn't make that kind of a change. And no matter how well-intentioned it was, trying to change cultural norms simply by passing a constitutional amendment or passing a law was unworkable. And as a consequence of that, the 18th Amendment is going to be repealed in 1933. You're going to get the 21st Amendment to the Constitution that's going to take away the authority of the national government to impose prohibition. That means the 18th Amendment is the only amendment to the Constitution that's ever been pulled out of it. No surprise that the 21st Amendment gets through in the opening years of the Great Depression. So when things were so bad, so desperate, you got rid of this during that era. You needed as much legal economic activity as you could possibly find, and people probably needed to drown their sorrows a little bit too. And so Prohibition is an experiment. It is an experiment that failed, but it was something that rural America and religious America had pushed really hard. It was the culmination of a very long effort to try and find a way to get rid of the problems associated with alcoholism. So the intent was good, but the mechanism proved to be unworkable. And unenforceable law is always a really bad idea because it makes government and law enforcement look weak, and it inspires resistance to other laws as well. Another thing that happens during the 1920s is the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan had been born in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War. It was initially a veterans organization for Confederate soldiers, and there were a lot of these such organizations, men trying to hold on to wartime camaraderie and take care of the wounded and crippled comrades or widows and orphans and these sorts of things. It had this name, the Ku Klux Klan, because in the second half of the 19th century, it was a fad in America to belong to organizations, and these organizations had to have, really cool, sort of bizarre-sounding names and cool costumes and secret handshakes and a lot of pomp and ceremony and that sort of stuff. But the Klan, although it starts off its existence as a veterans organization for Confederate soldiers, quickly morphed into a political and pseudo-military resistance to U.S. Army occupation of the South enforcement of Reconstruction policies. And remember that one of the things that Southerners, did not like was that, at the courtesy of the 14th and 15th Amendment, black Americans had been made citizens. They had been given the right to vote, or at least black men had been given the right to vote. They were, of course, very loyal to the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, because Lincoln is the guy that freed them. And so it was the black voter, along with the carpetbagger, who the people who come north to move into the South in the aftermath of the Civil War, that had kept the Republican Party in power in these basically democratic states for a decade after the end of the Civil War. And one of the things that Southerners tried to do to get their political power, or the Democrats tried to do to get their political power back, was to either persuade these black voters to switch to the Democratic Party, which of course had very little success, but then they could intimidate them. And so this is where the Klan, takes on the white robes and the white mask and the burning of crosses and the midnight rides and murder and beating and assassination, all these kinds of things, to try and scare blacks away from voting. If they couldn't ensure that you would vote Democratic, they were going to keep you from voting completely. And this had, by and large, failed. It backfired. President Ulysses S. Grant saw what was going on. He said he wasn't going to tolerate it. And he basically told Southern governments, told the Southern people, if the Klan doesn't stop what it's doing, I'm not going to withdraw our Army troops from the South, which is one of the things the Klan wants. I'm going to send more in. You're going to get exactly the opposite of what you're trying to achieve. And as a consequence of that, the Klan shriveled up and it died. It goes out of existence. So it's alive really for less than a decade in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. But in the dawn of the 20th century, the Klan is going to get a revival. And the revival sort of begins accidentally, if you will, when one of the great early producers in Hollywood, D.W. Griffith, who was a Virginian, made what was really the first great cinematic classic, the first great big screen saga in history. It was a silent film called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation was a sensation. It was a wildly popular film. It was cinematically a breakthrough watershed in technique and that kind of stuff. It dealt with the last year of the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was told very completely from a Southern point of view. It's still there. You can go online. You can get it. You can rent it. By modern standards, it is shockingly racist. It is a story of great Southern sacrifice at the end of the war, and then defeat, and then the South becomes oppressed by the carpetbaggers who are mistreating the South and stealing its wealth, and they're using black U.S. Army soldiers as sort of their muscle and these sorts of things. There's a scene where at one point a black soldier, who's actually a white guy in blackface because blacks weren't allowed to be in films in that day and age, is seen to be reaching out for a white woman, and she throws herself off of a cliff for fear that he's going to touch her. I mean, these even at the time, that was considered to be quite outrageous, and yet for all of that, the film was very popular. We have to remember that the standard of the time, most whites, North and South, East and West, were racist. They saw blacks as inferior, and so not everybody was as shocked by this as we might expect, but nonetheless, a lot of Americans were shocked by it. Nonetheless, Birth of a Nation, which comes out in 1919, is the first film ever to be screened in the White House. First film ever to be screened in the White House. Of course, you have only the second Democratic president since the outbreak of the Civil War, and you have the first Southern-born president since the outbreak of the Civil War. And so, maybe no surprise that the film is screened there, but probably screened there because it is great cinematic achievement. As filmmaking, it was It was breathtaking for its day, as sort of the Star Wars of its era, if you will, in its effect on the way that movies were made and scripts were written and that kind of thing. And President Woodrow Wilson had enthusiastically responded to the movie, called it history written with a lightning bolt, which is, quite the marketing coup there. Basically, at the end of the day, this movie has two effects. First off, it outrages a lot of Republicans and a lot of white Northerners and even white Southerners who were appalled both by its historical perspective and its racial perspective. This film is going to lead to protest and riots in a lot of northern cities, and in addition to that, it's going to lead to the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Which is still with us today, a very powerful organization, is born out of resistance to the message that the film Birth of a Nation was showing. It's also true that it was during this period that the American Civil Liberties Union is born out of resistance for the heavy-handed actions of the Wilson administration during World War I and during the Red Scare. So to every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and this is part of it. But from a cultural sense, what Birth of a Nation did was to glamorize and to glorify the Ku Klux Klan, who in the movie did not wear masks. They were like the cavalry riding to the rescue of good Christian white America, Gentile America, and so the Klan became popular, basically because of some cinematic myth of what the Klan had been, but in fact never was. The film can have a very powerful influence on culture in this way, and this all proved a boon to some people who in November of 1915 had actually tried to resurrect the Klan. Just 35 men had gotten together to form an organization that really is kind of representative of this idea of the rural counterattack. It is a reaction to fears of Bolsheviks and immigrants and this sorts of thing. So the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, if you will, was open only to native-born white Gentile Americans. You had been born in the United States, no immigrants. You had to be white, and you had to be Gentile. That meant you had to be Protestant. And at first, there wasn't much interest in this. The U.S. had not yet gotten involved in World War I. The flow of immigrants had basically turned itself off once the war in Europe broke out. And these guys seemed to be a little bit extreme. But then the movie happens, and suddenly the Klan is this romantic organization. And so in the 1920s, as you got the Red Scare, as you got the advent of nativism, as people became nervous about the changes that were happening in America, the Klan was suddenly out there marketing itself as a all-American institution that was going to defend American values, and was going to defend American ideas. It was going to, push back against the Catholic and the Jew and the black and the immigrant, and that was a message that resonated in a country that was very afraid of all the changes that immigration had worked and was working, fearful of the Bolsheviks and these sorts of things. And so, especially in the South and the West, people flocked to the Klan as a way to still their fears, as the way to feel like they were doing something to protect the America they knew, to protect the kind of stability that they were used to. And so the Klan actually operated on two different levels. There was a public face to the Klan, and the public face to the Klan was a happy face, if you will. They held fairs, they held picnics, they waved American flags, they did good works in the community, and these sorts of things. They sort of ran themselves like any other fraternal organization, but backside, the flip side of that coin, the sort of vaguely concealed underneath activities were beatings and terror, floggings, murders, lynchings of mostly blacks, but also Catholics, immigrants, Jews, these sorts of things. But all of this was kind of kept on the down low. To most people who were paying their dues to be members of the Klan, this was in many ways no different than most of the other civic-minded organizations that were out there. It stood for the flag, democracy, mom, apple pie, and these sorts of things. And the Klan eventually begins to get involved in politics, and this was the beginning of its undoing. It began to rank candidates for office, and it actually managed to win control of state legislatures in Texas and Oklahoma and Oregon and Indiana. By 1925, there were nearly 5 million members of the Klan. And of course, once it begins to become a political opponent, then suddenly Republicans and Democrats have a lot harder time. There were plenty of Democrats and a few Republicans who actually joined the Klan, sort of judging the political winds and going where their voters seemed to be going. But when they started to run candidates against the established parties, then there was a pushback, and there were actually congressional hearings that called the Klan on the carpet. But this actually didn't work. It backfired because it gave the Klan the ability to sort of have the soapbox and to say, no, all we're doing is defending a native-born Protestant America. We're pushing back against the threats to our way of life and that kind of stuff. So the Klan becomes more popular as a result of the attempts by the Congress and the Republicans and the Democrats to tear the Klan down. The thing that finally does the Klan in is muckraking. These investigative journalists who started to dig into the Klan and expose the truth, not of the beatings and the murders and that kind of, that's not the thing that turned everybody off, but to expose the reality that the people who had started and were running the Klan and were getting rich, the heads of the Klan, who were talking about defending good Christian morals and American ideas and all these kinds of stuff, were in fact hypocrites. They were scoundrels. This was not a movement of conviction on their part. This was a movement to separate people from their money. By selling memberships and by doing fundraising and selling magazines and these kinds of things. These people drank, they cavorted with prostitutes, they lived exactly the opposite kind of life privately as they claimed to be living publicly. And when the muckrakers exposed that, the people who had joined the Klan thinking that they were just joining yet another civic organization were turned off. They were horrified. They felt they had been lied to, that they had been duped, and they walked away from the Klan, and they walked away from it in droves. And it doesn't hurt at all, of course, that by this point the Red Scare has died off, and the Congress has been passing new laws to restrict immigration, and so some of the fears, the angst has burned itself out. The issues that had been worrying Americans have faded away, and the need to defend American ideas seems to have been lessened. But it was really discussed at the scandals in the leadership of the Klan that did it in. And that, combined with pushback from the traditional political parties, led to the Klan's demise. So by 1930, it was gone. It was gone. So it had lived for 15 years in this second iteration, and it had eventually been killed off as thoroughly at the end of that period as it had been killed off in the aftermath of the Civil War by the presidency of Grant. And the Klan is not going to come back until you get to the 1950s and the beginning of the desegregation movement in American history, and it will be resurrected one more time. So the other issue, of course, that it helped to drive a lot of this fear is fear of the immigrant. And so how does the country deal with that? How does it? So in 1917, Congress had overridden President Wilson's veto of a bill to enact a literacy test for people coming into the country. We passed a law that said you had to prove that you could read and write in order to come into the country. And the idea was that, that this was going to slow the flood of immigrants from Europe. But in fact, by 1917, that flood had really already stopped because of World War I. From 1900 to 1914, 1 million immigrants a year came into the United States, and most of them came into the big ports in the Northeast, but also places like Galveston in New Orleans and San Francisco and that sort of stuff. By 1918, there were only 110,000 immigrants coming in. So the war had really shut off the flow of immigrants that had been flooding into the country since the 1880s and 90s through the 1910s. But Americans were still afraid that there would be a new flood of immigrants after the war, as people fled the devastation and the economic dislocation of wartime Europe, and these people were going to come from parts of the world that had been wrecked, where governments and empires had dissolved, where Bolshevism had arisen, and they might be carrying those infections with them to the United States. It didn't quite happen in the way that it was feared, but still in 1920, 810,000 immigrants flowed into the U.S. So it looked like things were going to ramp up again, and the Congress acted to keep that from happening. So in 1921, it passed a new law, the Emergency Immigration Act. The Emergency Immigration Act, which restricted immigration from Europe to 3% of the nationals of each country already living in the U.S. So the Emergency Immigration Act restricts immigration from Europe to 3% of the nationals of each country already living in the U.S. So basically what you do is you say, okay, how many people of British descent are there in America? It's 5 million. Well, 3% of 5 million is what we'll accept in immigration from England. How many people are from Germany? It's 2 million, so 3% of the 2 million. And of course, what that does is it gives favored status to the older sources of immigration from Northern and Western Europe. It's going to discriminate against the newer sources from Southern and Eastern Europe, which of course is the regions where Bolshevism and socialism and all that kind of stuff are, and different kinds of religions are apt to get into the country. But so many people had come from this part of Europe in the decades before World War I that even with this restriction, you still had 500,000 immigrants enter the U.S. legally in 1923, and half of those were from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so it was believed that this was not good enough. And there was still a lot of fear of the immigrant, a lot of resentment of immigrants for undercutting wages, driving wages down because they were willing to work much more cheaply than a lot of Native Americans. And this traditional idea that you find being expressed against every immigrant group in American history, that these immigrants simply were not going to assimilate. As one writer put it, quote, "These immigrants adopt the language of the Native American. They learn to speak English, they wear his clothes, and are beginning to take his women, but they seldom adopt his religion or understand his ideas." In other words, they might eventually begin to look like Americans on the outside, but they're not really Americans. And we already discussed that the difficulty of the first generation assimilating, and it takes a generation or two for that to happen. But that's a long time in the life of actual people. It's a blink of the eye, historically speaking, but it still meant that there was a lot of angst there. So in 1924, Congress passed something called the National Origins Quota Act. The National Origins Quota Act, which limited immigration to 150,000 people per year. That was it. That's all the people that could come into the country, and then assigned quotas for each country in Europe. And most of the room was given to England, Ireland, Germany, and the Scandinavian nations. So we're really going to keep Southern and Eastern Europeans out. By and large, all immigration from Asia, was banned completely. The only place where immigration was not impacted was within the Americas itself. Mexico was not touched by this, and 100,000 Mexicans or Latin Americans were coming into the United States every year. But this law had overwhelming support, especially in rural America, and it would survive until the 1960s. And so when we look at this period, there is the happy-go-happy, modernizing, freer kind of culture and society, the economic explosion of technology and a consumer economy and this sorts of things. But then on the flip side, you have a country that's nervous, that's fidgety, that's scared, that's prone to hyper responses to perceived problems, and a country that is veering between overreacting and engaging in common sense. None of this, by the way, is going to hurt the Republican Party. So Warren G. Harding had come into the presidency. He had pushed back pretty effectively against the Red Scare. He is a popular president at the time. He's the first American president to visit Alaska. He went on a tour of the West Coast to connect with the American people. But he had been elected in 1920, and he's sort of reminiscent of Grant in that he himself seemed to be very honest, but his friends and political appointees were not. And so there's going to be a lot of scandal come out of the Harding administration, but none of it is going to impact him directly because being a president elected in a year that ends with zero, well, we kind of know what that means. Since 1860, every president elected or reelected in a year that ends with zero did not live through his term of office. And so we had Lincoln assassinated in 1860. We had Garfield assassinated after his election in 1880. Lincoln, of course, elected in 1860, assassinated in 1865. Then we had McKinley, who was reelected in 1900, who's assassinated. And Harding is not assassinated, but in July of 1923, he dies of a massive heart attack. And so his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, has to take over. And it is once Coolidge takes over that a lot of the scandals, the economic scandals of the Harding administration come out into the open. But Coolidge turned out to be an extremely competent president. He didn't say much. He believed that the government should be limited, that it should do what it needed to do, but no more than that. And the more the president talked, the more trouble he could get into, and the more difficulty he could cause the country. So Coolidge was sort of known as Silent Cow, and he's going to sort of weather the difficulties left by his predecessor and restore confidence in the government. And he's going to preside over this great economic renaissance of America following World War I, and the Republicans are going to get the credit for all the boom times. And Coolidge is going to get elected to the presidency in his own right in 1924 and serve until he is replaced by a new president in March of 1929. And so that's what we want to do with chapter 25. We will touch on some of the things that are going on in the 20s when we get into chapter 26 and we look at the Great Depression and try to understand where that came from. We'll have a reason to come back and visit some of the Republican policies in the 20s. But for now, we are done with the 1920s. We are done with chapter 25, and that means I've got 5 questions for you. These will be the last 5 questions that you will have to turn in as part of the second test. And so pens ready, here we go. The first of these questions, this would be question number 20. In what year did, for the first time, more than half of Americans live in towns or cities? In what year, for the first time ever, did more than half of Americans live in towns or cities? Okay. Question number 21. What law established national prohibition? What's the law that actually implemented national prohibition? Okay. Question number 22. What is the name of the film that helped give new life to the Ku Klux Klan? What is the name of the film that helped to give new life to the Ku Klux Klan? Question number 24, name the Republican president elected in 1920 who died in office in 1923. Name the Republican president who was elected in 1920 who died in office in 1923. And finally, question number 25, what is the name of the 1921 law restricting immigration from Europe to 3% of the nationals of a country already in the United States? What is the name of the 1921 law that restricted immigration from Europe to 3% of the nationals from that country or a country already living in the United States? So those are the 5 questions that finish up those that are due in for the second test. The essays have already been sent out. So remember, you can send me draft outlines, draft thesis paragraphs. I'm happy to give you feedback on that. Try and make sure you get started on the right foot, that you're covering the necessary ground, that you're being objective, looking at both sides. I'm here to help you do your very best. Might want to go out and look at the test prep video that I put out again as a sort of reminder. And please pay attention to the instructions about font size, formatting, the way that you name your essay and your questions when you send them in to me by email. It makes things a lot easier on my side and allows me to get them back to you in a very prompt fashion. So I look forward to hearing from you. When we have our next lecture, we will begin the third and final section of the course.